Hey guys, my name is Bryce, and today I'll be doing a video of all of my Toa 2015/2016 MOCs, kind of in one compilation video, and this is literally as wide as my backdrop set goes, which I might upgrade for another time, but this is sort of the biggest group shot I'm ever going to do. Now, the main reason for this is that I'll be doing these kind of as a display later on, but I wanted to show them sort of all together beforehand, and just sort of give you a summary of the quick overview of each individual and how they sort of combine to sort of form this team. So my sort of methodology in creating these was I really wanted to make sure that they play up to certain archetypes and still stay in character, since I've kind of grown up with these since 2001, like when I had the original very first DC comic. Yes, I do have a binder full of all of the DC comics that ever came to be, for I think up until basically like the Glatorian group, and then beyond that the subscription was a little bit more infrequent, and I'm afraid they eventually phased it out. But in the meantime, I'm pretty familiar with the characters' backstories, and the fun thing for me was sort of trying to figure out, okay, how can I incorporate these new LEGO elements and new Bionicle elements into characters that really sort of play up their old weapons and old personalities into very much like a new direction, a new look that's starting to happen right now. This is the first Toa that I tackled, so with Tahu I definitely wanted to go with how aggressive he is, and he's definitely a leader, so make sure I keep the sort of height thing the same as even the original photo, which is kind of what I'm trying to mimic here. The fact that his domain is actually in a volcano, I thought there was so much red but not enough suggestions of molten rock or things like that. He's definitely the Toa of fire, but the idea of actually having a lot of his armor being, molten or just being red hot and everything was kind of an interesting thing. And I actually got this mask itself in like a little poly bag from a promotion that was done at the LEGO store that I went to, and immediately I was like, okay, everything else needs to have as much transparent orange as possible, basically, and that's sort of what helped spur the rest of the detailing here. And as you can see, it's going to be kind of hard to fit these guys back into place now that I've got all these massive shoulders, essentially. But with the fists, they're going to be huge, because essentially they can even hold a full skull spider, which made for some really great photo shoots at first. Also, it's a little bit asymmetrical in terms of having some parts a little bit less on fire and red hot than others, because I feel like having a Toa of fire could actually be more feasible to have as asymmetrical as opposed to other characters. For example, Leiwa should probably be symmetrical to sort of encourage flight and speed and things like that. Fire in itself is naturally asymmetrical, it's just the chaotic form of it. Moving on to Pohatu, the shortest guy. As you've seen in previous videos, I've done so many versions of this one to get to this point. I even ended up modifying the shoes again as an homage to the first Pohatu and the Pohatu Nuva. The claws as well from 2002, and the story behind him is that I wanted to keep it symmetrical, very speedy, and I think overall that went fairly well. In terms of the next symmetrical guy was Leiwa, and again, this is going to be very hard to fit in the camera, even past my point of light here, but from what you can see, everything was about flight and wings, and essentially just giving as big a silhouette as possible for this guy, because especially now that he's no longer necessarily the Toa of air and Toa of jungle, all these wings need to naturally work rather than having a mask of levitation to sort of take care of the job for him. So this is hard to do without knocking over the other Toa, but essentially you get the idea where these wings can unfold. As you've seen in the past videos, his arms can actually move with this gearbox in the back, and he can still unite based on the back, because it's one of the two only 2016 Toa sets that I got, and that was just for preference. I like the weapons and the colors and everything. Much like his trickster personality, his weapons sort of can transform in terms of shape, so he can actually have the wings go right back for even more coverage, but he can also look like he's somewhat disarmed and then sort of swing them forward. He can have sort of like these underhanded blades, basically. And the nice thing, again, with this gearbox is they can actually go back and forth. Now, Onua definitely has the biggest change to his entire body type. Nobody else has this much of a squat torso, and these legs are incredibly short, because I really wanted to embrace the fact that this is a tunneling Toa who tries to spend more of his time underneath the surface rather than above. His claws also reflect that, where, as we've seen in the first version of him, all of his claws were sort of like a three-prong claw, and eventually ended up getting fists in 2015, but to actually give him graspers, I have this transformation possible, so he can actually kind of go from claws like this back into his sort of tunneling mode, you could say. Also, his torso can spin back and forth. Actually, all these have movable torsos except for Tahu, and they also have a gearbox that lets them move their arms up and down, so that's just one fewer thing to show. But yeah, Onua is heavily armored, really, really bulky, actually fairly heavy, especially compared to lighter weight Toa such as Pohatu and things like that. But all the way around, he's entirely clad. He's just incredibly strong now, especially without the mask of strength anymore. All of this just comes from being insanely built, basically. Now, moving on to Kopaka here. Kopaka is definitely the sort of one range weaponed Toa, and he also is the only one who I decided to have Mellum incorporated with us. It's technically is part of the set. Having a disconnect doesn't mean he's any less formidable, really. He has a shield that has a blaster incorporated into it, and he also has a sword, which you can actually manually use a gear for to spin around, and actually just fires accurately along one path, as well as the shield blaster. Now, very difficult to balance, unfortunately, so that's also where Mellum comes in handy as a sort of counterbalance backpack. But I think otherwise, though, the fact that his shield can still disconnect, and he can actually have it as a surface to sort of ride on and everything, is something I'm very glad I could actually keep as a part of it. Even these little spears can be flick-fired out of his shield, but I'll try not to do that just to avoid losing them. Considering the fact that Kopaka so often works alone, I really wanted to make sure that he was self-sufficient enough, not only in sort of melee combat, but also just taking out foes from afar. Even though he doesn't have a Mask of X-ray vision anymore, the fact that this is clearly somehow aiding how far he can see in terms of distance, at least that way he could engage with skull spiders or other enemies from a little bit further away than most of the other Toa. Of course, he can also use his elemental powers. Now moving on to the last Toa, but certainly not least, we have Gali. And she was definitely concealed by most of the Toa, but I think it's really unfortunate considering how much she's been kitted out. I wanted to turn her into possibly the quickest being under the Protodermis seas possible. I mean, the fact that she has all these propellers to not only be equipped onto her weapons, but even just onto her back. This effectively works as like a back propulsion system. All of her tools are very bulky in addition to her heavy body armor and everything, but she's incredibly strong, and she's able to wield these without problems, and for all the additional sort of accessories that seem to be added to her, they all have a purpose to play, whether it's steering or attacking and defending. Now for the last component of the video, what I'll do is I'll sort of go around and sort of explain each Toa's archetype and how I sort of designed the MOC around them, essentially. So starting with Gali, Gali is definitely the wisest, if not certainly tied with wisdom for Onua, potentially. She's so familiar with all of her tools and everything that I really wanted to give her the most tactical and very specific tools for her. The fact that her axes and also her picks, which are sort of like a far harkening back to her original hooks, are great for climbing with, but also help her get through the water much faster. Her trident on the back actually can propel itself as well as propel her when it's attached to the back. And her massive web feet, of course, help as well. But overall, though, she definitely has the most tools at her disposal, kind of on par with Kopaka, but they're very specified to the environment that she's in more often than not, and she's definitely faster than, any Rahi or anything else that she could be facing as a challenge. Now with Kopaka, as I said earlier, due to the fact that he has some sort of enhanced sight, if not for his mask of X-ray vision anymore, everything has to be either dealt with from as far as he can, because he's more of like a sort of strategist and everything. Although if anything comes enough for close quarters combat, he's more than ready with his shield and sword. And he definitely plays more of like the sort of tactician role and things like that. If he can figure out how to take down an opponent from a distance, if it's just firing off some ice blasts from the shield or his sword, he definitely has lots of options to not get his hands dirty right away. With Tahu, definitely the most brutal and sort of hulking figure, even compared to with Onua, just because he's got a bit more height and he's much more agile than Onua. Tahu, even without his mask of shielding, is fairly well fortified, and definitely by being able to just grasp onto his swords either individually and sort of dual wield them just like this, he could definitely just even be surfing on it, even as he's just surfing on lava. The fact that his fists are larger than, any of the other Toa's heads definitely suggests that he can handle himself, whether armed or unarmed. While Pahatu has continued from his past of armaments of claws and his reinforced toes and everything like that, I didn't bulk him up too much just because he's one of the shorter members of the group, and he's got to have agility and speed as his sort of main ways of dealing with opponents, so that's why I left him as slightly less. But his symmetry and his general aerodynamics, save for his shoes, means that there's very little drag, and being in the desert too, there's not too much you can carry on yourself without exhaustion, so I kept everything fairly minimal. Then we have Lewa. The fact that Lewa can always sort of re-energize from the jungle as opposed to Pohatu, who's probably just trying not to get eaten by a bunch of Rahi. Lewa seems much more in tune with the sort of natural elements, and so that's why even his armor sort of seems overgrown with all these huge thorns and all these sort of plant-like elements, of course. I really wanted to drive home the fact that even though he's just green combined with silver, all of this is very much an extension of him, or so closely related to it that, it's just a sort of another set of limbs for him, including his wings and everything, which you can't see as well here. The fact that Lewa also is still the sort of jokester, the lighthearted one, I like the idea of having an over-the-top sort of robe and everything, all the while I'm keeping things still fairly necessary for his costume design and incorporating it into how he can actually fight off evil. And lastly, with Onua, he has no weapons to speak of other than his claws. I was considering giving him those sort of early versions of like the sort of ground cutting chainsaws, but I think he really doesn't need that in this case. Now with Onua, I was on the fence about not giving him those sort of chainsaw claws, and it was really tempting. Originally I was going to try and put chainsaws on the end of each finger rather than giving him like these massive wing-like claws, but I think this is kind of all that's necessary for all the extra tooling and armaments that all the other Toa have. Onua is happy to fight with his bare fists, even more than Tahu. The fact that his claws are larger than the original Toa's torsos, taking on enemies is generally not going to be a problem as long as Onua can get close enough to them quickly. So as a lightning round, Burrower, who has no problem with close quarters, sort of the joking trickster who can conceal and reveal his weapons at will, the no-nonsense Toa who just needs to get there quickly with as little gear as possible, the berserker who can run in the heat of battle, whether he has his dual swords or not, he'll always be the last one out of the fight, the strategist who'd rather deal with opponents at a distance rather than close quarters, but should they get that far, it's not a problem to take care of them, and lastly the master of her tools, which are perfect for her environment, and when used correctly can be utterly devastating. So that summarizes my bright and colorful collection of Toa. But aside from Onua, I considered having purple, but I like the original, just sort of all black and completely blending into minerals. But aside from that, this group of Toa is kind of my go-to now.